Ambitious son betrays elderly mother for money, but dad's Christmas letter brings him to his knees. When a beloved Christmas toy shop faces closure after 40 years, a hidden letter from the past could change everything. Will a son's ambition destroy his father's legacy, or will the true spirit of Christmas prevail? Join us for The Last Christmas Present, a touching story about family, faith, and remembering that some gifts can't be wrapped, some treasures can't be bought, and some legacies are worth more than gold. Grab a warm cup of cocoa and settle in for a tale that will remind you why Christmas miracles never go out of style. The gentle tinkle of Christmas bells filled Sullivan's toy shop as Margaret hung the last of the handmade ornaments on the store's front window display. At 68, her movements were slower than they used to be, but her eyes sparkled with the same joy they had 40 years ago when she and Thomas first opened the shop. "Perfect," she whispered, stepping back to admire the wooden train set Thomas had carved their first Christmas here. The morning sun caught the polished wood, still gleaming after all these years of holiday displays. The peaceful moment shattered as she noticed a man in a suit approaching the store, manila envelope in hand. Her heart sank. Another official-looking visitor couldn't mean anything good. "Mrs. Sullivan?" He adjusted his glasses. "I'm from the City Safety Inspector's office. We've received complaints about potential code violations." Margaret's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope. "Complaints? But we've always. New regulations, ma'am. You'll need to address these issues within 30 days, or..." He glanced around the historic storefront. "Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that." As the bell chimed his exit, Margaret sank into the old rocking chair by the counter, the same one where she'd sat reading stories to neighborhood children for decades. Opening the envelope revealed a list of violations that made her head spin: outdated wiring, insufficient emergency lighting, non-compliant wheelchair access. The estimate for repairs would be astronomical. As if on cue, the mail slot rattled. Another envelope, this one from First National Bank. Past due notices were becoming frighteningly regular lately. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, touching the wedding ring she still wore, "I'm trying so hard to keep our dream alive." The store's bell chimed again, this time bringing a welcome face. Eleanor Jenkins, one of their very first customers, stepped in with a young boy in tow. "Margaret, the window looks beautiful as always." Eleanor hugged her old friend. "I had to bring my grandson Michael to see it. Remember that Christmas horse you and Thomas sold me for his mother 30 years ago?" Margaret smiled, remembering the hand-painted rocking horse Thomas had stayed up 3 nights finishing. Sarah treasured that horse. She really did. "Still has it," Eleanor nodded. "Wouldn't let us get rid of it even when she went to college. Now Michael here rides it when he visits." The boy looked around wide-eyed at the handcrafted toys lining the shelves. "Grandma says you and Grandpa used to get all your Christmas presents here, Mom?" "That's right," Eleanor smiled. "This store is special. There's magic in these old walls, the kind you can't find in those big box stores at the mall." Margaret felt tears threatening as she watched Michael discover the train set in the window. The same wonder she'd seen in thousands of children's eyes over the years. The same magic that had made all the long hours and tight budgets worthwhile. Her cell phone buzzed, a text from her son Richard. "Need to discuss something important. Coming tomorrow." The knot in her stomach tightened. Richard hadn't visited since last Christmas, and his calls usually meant trouble. He'd been pushing her to modernize the store, to maximize its potential. As if Thomas's legacy could be measured in profit margins. Alone again after Eleanor and Michael left, Margaret locked the front door and climbed the narrow stairs to the small apartment above the shop where she and Thomas had lived their entire married life. In the bedroom, she knelt beside their bed as she did every night. "Lord," she prayed softly, "give me strength. This store isn't just our livelihood, it's our gift to this community. All these precious memories, all the joy we've shared, please help me find a way to keep it alive." She glanced at Thomas's photo on the nightstand, his kind eyes seeming to twinkle with their shared secret. "I promise I won't give up," she whispered. "Whatever comes tomorrow, I'll find a way to protect what we built." The Christmas lights from the store window below cast soft patterns on the ceiling, just like they had that first Christmas when they danced among the unpacked boxes, young and full of dreams. Margaret closed her eyes, holding that memory close as worry about tomorrow tried to crowd it out. The next morning, Margaret opened the shop's doors to find the weekly prayer group already waiting outside. As she welcomed them in, Mrs. Patterson's voice carried over the others. "We're praying extra hard for small businesses this season," she said, settling into her usual spot. First the bakery closed, then the hardware store. The bell chimed, cutting her off. Richard stood in the doorway, his designer suit a stark contrast to the homey interior. The prayer group fell silent. "Mom." He gave her a quick hug. "Sorry to interrupt." "We were just finishing," Mrs. Patterson said, though they'd barely started. The group dispersed quickly, sharing concerned glances. Richard surveyed the store, frowning at the handmade displays. "Mom, this place looks exactly the same as when I was 10. "People like it this way," Margaret replied. "Just yesterday, Eleanor brought her grandson." "That's the problem." Richard paced between the aisles. "You're running on nostalgia while the bills pile up. We need to talk about the future." Margaret's chest tightened. "I'm managing fine." "Are you?" He pulled out his phone, showing spreadsheets. "I checked the store's accounts. You're barely breaking even. Christmas is our busy season." "Mom, wake up. You can't compete with Amazon and Walmart. These handmade toys, nobody wants to pay premium prices for." "Your father made that train set you're criticizing," Margaret interrupted. "Remember how you used to help him sand the pieces every Christmas?" Richard's expression softened momentarily. "I was a kid. Times change." The store bell chimed again. Sarah Mitchell walked in, carrying sheet music. She stopped short at seeing Richard. "Rich? Wow, it's been forever." She smiled. "I'm helping with the Christmas choir this year. Margaret, I brought the music for." She noticed the tension in the room. "Is everything okay?" "Fine," Richard said curtly, "just discussing business." Sarah's smile faded. "Business? This store isn't just a business, Rich. Remember our Christmas pageant practices here? You had the solo and silent night. I remember wasting afternoons that could have been spent studying." He checked his watch. "Mom, we need to discuss modernization, starting with clearing out all this outdated inventory." "These aren't inventory," Margaret said quietly. "They're your father's legacy." "Dad's legacy is a failing business?" "He was smarter than that, Mom. He would have adapted." Margaret watched her son, trying to reconcile this stranger with the boy who once spent hours helping customers find perfect Christmas gifts. Who knew every story behind every handmade toy? Sarah lingered by the door. "The choir would love to practice here again this year, Margaret. Like old times." "Of course, dear. Thursday evenings?" Richard's phone rang. He stepped outside to answer it, speaking in hushed tones. "Something's wrong," Sarah said once he was out of earshot. "That's not the Rich I knew growing up." Margaret nodded, remembering how Richard's visits grew shorter and calls more infrequent after Thomas died. Each time, he pushed harder about maximizing the property value. Through the window, she watched him pacing, gesturing forcefully into his phone. A word caught her ear. "Developers." Sarah squeezed her hand. "We're all here for you, Margaret, the whole community." After Sarah left, Richard returned, his businessman mask firmly in place. "Mom, you need to face reality. This building is worth more than the business. If you sold." "No." Margaret's voice was firm. "Your father and I built this place to be more than just property value. Dad would have wanted you taken care of, not struggling to keep a dying business afloat. Your father believed in something bigger than money." She met his eyes. "What happened to that little boy who believed that too?" Richard gathered his coat. "That little boy grew up, Mom. Maybe it's time you did too." After he left, Margaret found herself in front of the old photo wall. Richard at 8, proudly displaying his father's first lesson in woodworking. At 12, helping wrap presents for needy families. At 16, performing that Christmas solo. Her son was in there somewhere, behind those cold spreadsheets and business talks. She just had to find a way to reach him before it was too late. James Thompson parked outside Sullivan's toy shop just as choir members started arriving for practice. He'd been the store's lawyer and Thomas's friend for over 30 years. "Margaret," he touched her arm gently. "Got a minute?" They headed to the back office while Sarah organized the choir in the main room. Christmas carols drifted through the thin walls. "Thomas left something with me," James said, closing the door. A letter to be opened this Christmas, the store's 40th anniversary. Margaret sat down. A letter. Why didn't you tell me before? His instructions were specific. He said you'd need it most this Christmas. James straightened his tie. Margaret, I've heard rumors about developers interested in this block. Richard's been pushing to sell. She sighed. He was just here talking about modernization. The office door opened. The safety inspector was back, clipboard in hand. More violations, Mrs. Sullivan. He circled the room. Exposed wiring, outdated fire system. Quite serious. James stepped forward. I'm Mrs. Sullivan's attorney. We'll need to see documentation of these alleged violations. Of course. The inspector smiled thinly, though getting up to code might be costly. After he left, James frowned. 3 inspections in 2 weeks? That's unusual. The choir started Silent Night, Sarah's voice leading them. Through the office window, Margaret spotted Richard entering the store through the back door, heading straight for the filing cabinets. I should see what he's doing, she said. Margaret? James stopped her. Thomas knew this day might come. That letter, he said it would protect everything you built together. In the main room, Richard was rifling through old documents while the choir practiced. Sarah watched him between verses, concern evident on her face. Looking for something? Margaret asked. Richard jumped. Just reviewing the store's papers. As your son, I have a right. As my son, Margaret emphasized, not as a businessman. Sarah called a break, approaching them. Rich, what's really going on? This isn't like you. You don't know me anymore, Sarah. We're not kids. No, she agreed. The Rich I knew would never hurt his mother. Richard's phone buzzed. He stepped away to answer it, but not before Margaret caught words like zoning and timeline. Sarah touched Margaret's shoulder. I've known your son since first grade, Det Steinberg. Something's wrong. He's scared. Margaret nodded. While the choir resumed practice, she searched her office. In the bottom drawer, she found what she'd forgotten. A power of attorney document she'd signed years ago when she was sick. Richard's name was on it. The choir's voices swelled with peace on earth, but peace felt very far away. Through the window, she watched Richard pacing outside on his phone. His face was strained, desperate. This wasn't her son's usual confidence. Sarah was right. He was scared. James appeared beside her. Margaret, there's something else. Before Thomas died, he made investments, said they were for the store's future. Investments? That was news to her. Thomas had always kept things simple. He didn't want you to worry. Said you'd know when the time was right. A loud knock interrupted them. A courier delivered an envelope. Official notice from the city. Margaret's hands shook as she read it. They're giving us 30 days to vacate, she whispered, claiming unsafe conditions. The choir's voices faded as reality sank in. 40 years of memories, thousands of children's Christmas mornings, countless community gatherings, all threatened by paperwork and profits. Richard returned, seeing the notice in her hands. For a moment, his businessman's mask slipped, showing real fear. Mom, you have to understand. Understand what? Sarah interrupted. That you're destroying your parents' legacy? I'm trying to save. He stopped, running his hands through his hair. You don't understand. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him. Beyond the expensive suit and corporate manner, she saw something in his eyes. The same look he'd had as a child when he broke Thomas's favorite carving tool and tried to hide it. Richard, she said softly, whatever trouble you're in, we can face it together. He stepped back. It's too late for that. As he hurried out, Sarah squeezed Margaret's hand. We'll find a way. This store means too much to too many people. Margaret touched the old power of attorney document in her pocket. She thought of Thomas's mysterious letter, his secret investments, their son's desperate actions. What else had her husband planned for? What was Richard hiding? And would the truth come in time to save their family's legacy? The choir's voices rose again, singing of comfort and joy, while Margaret prayed for strength to face whatever came next. Margaret was organizing sheet music for the evening's choir practice when she overheard Richard's voice from the storage room. Everything's on track, he was saying. The power of attorney is valid. She won't be able to stop the sale. The sheet music slipped from her hands. Sale? She moved closer to the door. Look, I know the timeline is tight, Richard continued, but the inspection citations will force her out. By Christmas, the property will be yours. The choir members began arriving, their cheerful greetings masking Margaret's shock. Sarah was setting up chairs when she saw Margaret's face. "What's wrong?" she whispered. Before Margaret could answer, Richard emerged from the storage room. He froze when he saw her. "Mom, you're selling my store?" Her voice was barely audible. "Behind my back?" The choir members fell silent. Richard glanced around, then gestured toward the office. "Let's discuss this privately." "No." Margaret stood her ground. "I want to hear you explain to everyone why you're destroying 40 years of Christmas memories." "You don't understand," Richard said. "This isn't about memories, it's about money." Sarah stepped forward. "Is that all this place means to you now?" Just then, Christmas carolers appeared outside the shop window, their voices rising in joy to the world. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "I'm trying to protect you," Richard insisted. "Mom, you're drowning in debt. The building needs massive repairs." "So you went behind my back, used that old power of attorney?" "Because you won't listen to reason." Richard's composure cracked. "You think Dad would want you working yourself to death keeping this place alive? Don't you dare use your father to justify this." Margaret's voice shook. Thomas believed in more than profit margins. Dad's beliefs didn't pay the bills. Richard's outburst silenced even the carolers outside. "You want the truth? I need this sale. I lost everything." The room went still. "What do you mean, everything?" Margaret asked. Richard sank into a chair. "I trusted the wrong people, made investments that they were a fraud. I'm facing bankruptcy, possible criminal charges. This property is my only way out." Sarah gasped. "Rich, why didn't you tell us?" "Tell you what? That I failed? That everything I built was a lie?" He laughed bitterly. "The great Richard Sullivan, brought down by his own arrogance." Margaret touched her son's shoulder. "We could have helped." "No, Mom." He pulled away. "You can barely keep this place afloat. The developer's offer is the only solution. They'll pay enough to save you and keep me out of jail." The carolers outside started Silent Night. Margaret remembered Thomas singing it to Richard as a baby. "Your father made me promise," she said quietly. "On his deathbed, he made me swear to protect this store. He said it was more than just a business." "He's gone, Mom, and his old-fashioned values won't save either of us now." The choir members began quietly leaving. Sarah stayed, her hand on Margaret's arm. "The developers gave me until Christmas," Richard continued. "Then they'll force the sale through the power of attorney. I'm sorry, but there's no other way." Margaret looked around the store, at the toys Thomas had made, the photos on the walls, the memories in every corner. "There's always another way," she said firmly. "Your father believed that. He taught you to believe it too. That was a long time ago." Richard stood. "I've got a meeting with the developers. Mom, please, just make this easier for everyone." After he left, Sarah helped Margaret to a chair. "The whole town will help," she promised. "We won't let this happen." Margaret touched her wedding ring. Thomas knew this day might come. That's why he left the letter with James. "What's in it?" "We'll find out at Christmas." Margaret watched more carolers gathering outside. "If the store survives that long," Sarah squeezed her hand, "it will. Rich may have lost his way, but he's still Thomas's son. Deep down, he remembers what this place means." Margaret nodded, praying Sarah was right. Somewhere inside that desperate businessman was the boy who once believed in Christmas miracles. She just had to find him before it was too late for all of them. Pastor Miller stood at the church podium, addressing the packed Sunday service. Sullivan's Toy Shop isn't just a store. It's the heart of our community's Christmas tradition. Heads nodded throughout the congregation. Margaret sat in her usual pew, overwhelmed by the support. "The radio station has offered us a special segment," the pastor continued. "We'll share our stories about what this store means to our town. Margaret, would you be our first guest?" "I'll do better," she said. "I have 40 years of customer records, real stories of how this store touched lives." After the service, the local radio host, Tom Baker, set up his equipment in the store. Families started arriving, eager to share their memories. "My first job was here," said Mike Peterson, now a grandfather. "Thomas taught me woodworking. Now I make toys for my grandkids." The bell chimed. Richard stood in the doorway listening. "Remember this, Rich?" Johnson called out. "The Christmas you helped my Tommy pick out a gift for his dad in the hospital? That was his last Christmas with us." Richard shifted uncomfortably. Tom Baker seized the moment. "Mr. Sullivan, would you share some memories?" "I should go," Richard started, but his eye caught something behind the counter. Margaret followed his gaze. An old letter, faded and worn, peeked from a box of Christmas cards. Richard's childhood handwriting was visible. "Dear Santa, at Sullivan's toy shop." She retrieved the letter. "You were 8, she said softly. Richard took it hesitantly. "Dad said if I helped in the store all December, Santa would know I deserved that special train set." "You worked so hard," Margaret smiled. "Even stayed late Christmas Eve to help wrap presents for the children's home." The radio host moved closer with his microphone, but Richard was already heading for the door. "I have meetings." As he left, Sarah arrived with more families. The school's doing a special segment, 3 generations of Sullivan's customers. The stories flowed all afternoon. Margaret went upstairs during a break to get more photos. In Thomas's old filing cabinet, she found a hidden folder, Christmas Fund. Inside were records of secret donations, toys given to families who couldn't afford them, quiet acts of kindness spanning decades. The phone rang. "Mrs. Sullivan?" A sharp voice said. "This is Claire Davidson from Pine Valley Development. We're prepared to increase our offer by 50%. The store isn't for sale. According to our agreement with your son, it is. Don't make this difficult." Margaret's hands shook as she hung up. Downstairs, she heard more families arriving. "The store gave us Christmas the year Dad lost his job," a young mother was saying. "We never knew who paid for those presents." Margaret clutched Thomas's donation records. Their secret ministry of kindness hidden all these years. The bell chimed again. Richard walked in, his face tense. He'd obviously heard the radio broadcast. "Mom, the developers raised their offer." "I know." She held up the Christmas Fund folder. "Did you know about this?" He took it, flipping through the pages. Recognition dawned in his eyes. The extra hours Dad worked, this is where the money went? Every Christmas, she touched a photo of young Richard helping wrap presents. "You were part of it too, though you didn't know." Richard stared at the records of generosity. All these years. A commotion at the door interrupted them. Several reporters had arrived, drawn by the radio broadcast. "Mrs. Sullivan, is it true the developers are forcing you out?" Before she could answer, Margaret felt the room spin. The stress of the past weeks caught up with her. "Mom!" Richard caught her as she stumbled. "Get her upstairs," Sarah ordered, handling the reporters. "She needs rest." In her apartment, Richard helped her to bed. For a moment, he was her little boy again, worried about his mother. "The developers," she whispered. "They won't stop. Don't worry about that now." He straightened her blanket awkwardly. "Your father believed helping others was more important than profits." Richard looked at the Christmas Fund folder he still held. "Get some rest, Mom." Downstairs, the radio broadcast continued. More stories of Christmas magic, of community, of love, spanning generations. Margaret closed her eyes, praying her son would remember he was part of that story too, before it was too late for all of them. James Thompson arrived at the store early, carrying a worn leather briefcase. Margaret was already there, sorting through old Christmas cards. "The letter," James said, sitting down. Thomas linked it to his will. He was very specific about the timing. "But why Christmas? Why this year?" "He said you'd understand when the time came." James glanced around. "Has Richard been back since?" The store bell interrupted them. Richard rushed in, but stopped short at seeing James. "The developers called," Richard said. "They're getting impatient." "Sit down, son." James opened his briefcase. "There's something you both need to know." Before he could continue, Richard's phone rang. His face paled at the caller ID. "Mr. Martinez, please. I just need more time." He walked away, voice strained. Margaret noticed something unusual on a high shelf, Thomas's old Bible box. She'd forgotten about it after his death. "Richard," she called, "help me reach that box." He returned, still shaken from his call. As he lifted down the box, something fell from inside. Stock certificates, yellowed with age. Dad invested in stocks? Richard picked them up. Thomas was more forward-thinking than people knew, James said. He had plans. The bell chimed again. 2 men in suits entered. "Mr. Sullivan?" The taller one approached Richard. "We represent your creditors. The deadline for repayment." "This isn't the place," Richard interrupted, glancing at Margaret. "You've avoided our calls." "The courts, please." Margaret stood up. Today's our church charity event. Could this wait? The men exchanged looks but left. Richard slumped in a chair. We hate the developer's offer won't cover it all, he admitted. I thought it would, but... Sarah arrived with volunteers to set up for the charity event. Margaret, the whole congregation's coming, even old members who moved away. As they transformed the store for the event, Margaret examined Thomas's Bible box. Hidden in a false bottom, she found a key with a note, for when the time comes. The afternoon brought a stream of familiar faces. Children sang carols while parents shared memories. Remember that Christmas drive when Thomas fixed all those broken bikes? Pastor Miller asked. Worked nights for weeks. Richard stood apart, watching. His phone kept buzzing, but he'd stopped answering. Sarah approached him. I found something at the school, she said quietly. Old records from when your dad was on the board. You should see them. Not now, Sarah. Rich, it's important. It's about the store's property. Before she could explain, more creditors arrived. Richard slipped out the back door. Margaret watched him go, clutching Thomas's key. What had her husband planned? What was in that mysterious letter? The charity event continued into evening. Margaret overheard snippets of conversations, memories of Thomas's quiet generosity, stories of Christmas miracles. That's what we're fighting for, Sarah said, joining her. Not just a store, a legacy of love. Margaret nodded, fingering the key. Thomas knew this day would come. He prepared for it. But will his preparations be enough? Sarah watched through the window as Richard argued with creditors in the street. He believed they would be. Margaret held the Bible box close. He always said faith moves mountains. As the event wound down, the congregation sang Silent Night, the same song they'd sung at Thomas's funeral. Richard slipped back in, standing in the shadows. For a moment, in the soft Christmas lights, he looked like his father. Margaret prayed it wasn't too late for her son to remember who he really was, and what Christmas at Sullivan's toy shop truly meant. The church hall buzzed with activity as families gathered for the Save Sullivan's Toy Shop benefit. Children from the choir assembled near the Christmas tree, their voices rising in familiar carols. Next up, Sarah announced, songs from the store's first Christmas show 40 years ago. Richard stood at the back, watching a small boy struggle with his sheet music. Something about the child's frustrated expression triggered a memory. Tommy? He called out. Tommy Martinez? The boy looked up. How'd you know my name? I went to school with your dad. Richard knelt beside him. Is he here? Tommy's face fell. Dad's working. He works a lot now. Richard remembered the desperate phone calls from Mr. Martinez, his former friend and investment partner, now struggling after their financial disaster. The children began singing Away in a Manger, the same arrangement they'd used decades ago. Margaret watched her son's face as recognition dawned. You sang that solo, she said softly, the Christmas before Dad got sick. Before Richard could respond, Sarah hurried over with an old leather book. Found this while setting up, she said. It's Thomas's diary. Margaret opened it carefully. Inside, page after page revealed Thomas's detailed plans for the store's future. He knew the neighborhood would change, Margaret read. He was preparing for it. Richard moved closer, scanning the entries. His father's neat handwriting mapped out investments, community programs, even plans for expansion. Dad wasn't just running a store, he whispered. He was building a legacy. The diary's final entry caught their attention. Remember, son, true wealth isn't in bank accounts. It's in the lives we touch. The benefit continued around them. Elderly customers shared stories with young families. Children played with toys Thomas had made decades ago. Suddenly, the front doors burst open. Claire Davidson from Pine Valley Development strode in, followed by lawyers. This is harassment, she announced. These publicity stunts won't change anything. We have a binding agreement. You have nothing. Sarah stepped forward, holding up a document. The school board records show Thomas Sullivan put a community service covenant on this property. It can't be developed commercially. Richard stared at the document, then at Tommy Martinez, still struggling with his music. Is that true? He asked Sarah. Your father believed in protecting what matters. She handed him the covenant. He made sure no one could destroy it. Claire Davidson's face reddened. We'll challenge this in court. We'll. No, Richard interrupted. No more legal battles. Margaret touched his arm, seeing something change in his expression. The children's choir started another song. Do you hear what I hear? Tommy Martinez's voice wavered on the high notes, just like Richard's had at that age. Remember how Dad stayed after hours to help you practice? Margaret asked softly. Richard nodded, watching Tommy. He said music was like kindness. It only works if you share it. Through the windows, more townspeople were arriving. The radio broadcast had spread the word. The whole community was rallying. Claire Davidson wasn't finished. Mr. Sullivan, need I remind you of your financial obligations? Without this deal, I'll face whatever's coming, Richard said, but not by destroying this. He gestured around the room, at the children singing, the families gathering, the generations of memories. Dad knew, he said quietly to Margaret. He knew the money would never be enough. The diary in Margaret's hands seemed to pulse with Thomas's presence. His final message was clear. The store was more than just a business. It was a mission. As the evening continued, Richard found himself beside Tommy Martinez, helping with the music just as Thomas had once helped him. The boy's face lit up as he hit the right notes. In that moment, Richard understood what his father had been trying to tell him all along. Some things were worth more than money. Some legacies couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. The question was, had he realized it in time to save them all? 24 hours, Claire Davidson announced, dropping legal documents on the store counter. Then we proceed with the forced sale. Margaret stared at the stack of papers. 1 day left to save 40 years of dreams. Sarah burst through the door, waving a folder. Margaret, the power of attorney. I found something. Not now, Richard interrupted, but Sarah continued. The document was signed during Margaret's illness, she explained. State law requires a medical evaluation for legal validity. There wasn't one. Claire Davidson's smile faltered. Our legal team can't override state law. Sarah placed the statute in front of them. The power of attorney is void. Richard stepped back, relief and worry battling on his face. Davidson pulled out her phone. This changes nothing, she snapped. We'll find another way. Mr. Sullivan, remember our agreement. After she left, Margaret touched Richard's arm. What agreement? They offered to handle the creditors, he admitted. Keep my name out of the fraud investigation. Sarah gasped. They're blackmailing you? The store bell chimed. Families started arriving for the 40th anniversary celebration, unaware of the drama unfolding. Rich, Sarah said quietly, we found more records. Your dad's community impact reports. Decades of service documented. Margaret was already setting up the anniversary displays, including a special album she'd been preparing. The media's outside, Sarah continued. If the developers push this, their reputation. Richard's phone buzzed. Mr. Martinez's name appeared. Tommy asked about you, Sarah added. He's practicing that song for tonight. Richard stared at his phone, then at the growing crowd outside. Parents with children, elderly couples, 3 generations of customers. The developers aren't just buying a building, Margaret said, opening her album. They're trying to erase this. She pointed to photos, holiday food drives, literacy programs, Christmas shows, page after page of community service. Your father believed business should serve people, not profit from them. Richard picked up the album. Is this what you've been working on? Your father kept everything. Margaret turned a page. Every thank you note. Every child's drawing, every life we touched. The celebration crowd grew. The local news crew set up cameras as Pastor Miller organized a prayer vigil. They can't fight the whole town, Sarah said. Your dad made sure of that. Richard found a photo of himself at 10, helping Thomas repair toys for the children's home. I thought Dad was too soft, he said quietly. Too focused on giving instead of growing. He grew something bigger than money, Margaret replied. Look outside. The street was filling with people holding candles. The children's choir assembled, Tommy Martinez in front. Claire Davidson's voice cut through the moment. Mr. Sullivan? A word? She marched toward them, phone extended. The developer's final offer. Think carefully before. Her voice trailed off as she saw what Richard was holding, the Community Impact album. This isn't just business, he said. My father understood that. Don't be a fool, she hissed. The creditors will get their money, Sarah interrupted. The community's starting a legal fund. Outside, the choir began singing. Tommy's voice carried the melody, clear and strong, just as Richard's once had. Margaret watched her son's face. The businessman was fading, revealing the boy who once believed in Christmas miracles. "Dad's letter," he said suddenly. "The one James has. It's not just about memories, is it?" Margaret smiled. "Your father was always planning ahead." The vigil crowd started singing Silent Night. Through the window, candlelight illuminated faces of all ages, all part of Sullivan's Toy Shop's legacy. Claire Davidson checked her watch. 24 hours, Mr. Sullivan. Choose wisely." After she left, Richard looked at his mother. "When's the letter supposed to be opened?" "Christmas morning." He nodded slowly, watching Tommy lead the choir. "Think we can hold them off until then?" For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt hope. Together, with all these people? She squeezed his hand. "Your father would say anything's possible at Christmas." The question was, would Thomas's final gift arrive in time to save them all? Christmas morning dawned with a crowd already gathering outside Sullivan's toy shop. James Thompson arrived early, carrying the sealed envelope. "Before we open it," he said, "there's something else." He pulled out Thomas's old investment portfolio. "I found these records last night." Margaret and Richard sat at the old counter while James spread out the documents. "Your father started buying tech stocks in the early 90s, James explained. "Small companies then. Apple, Microsoft, Amazon." Richard's hands shook as he read the statements. "These shares, they're worth millions," James confirmed. Thomas knew the neighborhood would change. He was preparing for it. The crowd outside grew larger. Sarah arrived with Pastor Miller and the choir. "It's time," James said, holding up Thomas's letter. Margaret opened it carefully, her heart pounding. Richard leaned closer as she began to read. "My dear family, if you're reading this, our store faces its greatest challenge. The neighborhood's changing, and developers see only dollar signs where we see memories. But I saw it coming. Every Christmas, I invested part of our profits in companies I believed would shape the future. Richard, you used to ask why I spent so much time reading business magazines. Now you know. The stocks are now worth enough to not just save the store, but transform it. The papers James has will explain everything. But money isn't the real gift I'm leaving. Margaret, remember when we started? We had nothing but faith and a dream of bringing joy to children. That dream grew into something bigger, a mission to serve our community. Richard, son, I watched you help families choose presents they could barely afford. I saw you learn that true wealth isn't in our bank accounts, but in the lives we touch. The developers think they're buying a building. They don't understand they're trying to buy 40 years of Christmas miracles." Richard stopped reading, his voice cracking. Sarah took the letter, continuing. "I've left detailed plans with James. The store can become a community center, offering programs year-round. The investment income will fund everything, including help for families struggling like we once were. Richard, you have your mother's heart and my head for business. That's why this letter comes now. You needed to remember what Christmas means at Sullivan's before you could lead it into the future." Pastor Miller touched Richard's shoulder as Margaret read the final paragraphs. "The Bible says where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Our treasure isn't in stocks or property values. It's in every child who ever pressed their nose against our window, every family we helped through hard times, every Christmas miracle we were blessed to be part of. Remember, Christmas isn't about what we get, but what we give. And love, like the toys in our shop, only works when it's shared. With eternal love, Dad." Silence filled the store. Outside, the choir began singing O Holy Night. Richard found the investment records, his banker's mind calculating. "This is more than enough to pay my debts, save the store, and help others," Margaret finished, "like your father always did." The door chimed. Claire Davidson strode in, followed by lawyers. "Time's up. The developers can find another property," Richard interrupted. "This one's not for sale. Not now, not ever." He handed her the store's new incorporation papers from James. Sullivan's Community Center and Toy Shop, a registered nonprofit. "You'll regret this," she warned. "No," Richard smiled, watching Tommy Martinez lead the choir. "I'll regret that it took me so long to understand what Dad knew all along." After the developers left, Margaret opened the shop doors. Families poured in, carrying cookies, decorations, and 40 years of memories. "Mom," Richard said quietly, "I'm sorry I forgot what Christmas means." Margaret hugged her son. "You remembered in time. That's what matters." Through the window, snow began falling, the first white Christmas in years. Inside, surrounded by community and love, the legacy of Sullivan's toy shop was secure at last. But Thomas's final gift wasn't the money. It was the reminder that true wealth comes from giving, not getting. A lesson wrapped in 40 years of Christmas memories. The Christmas Day service at First Community Church was packed. When Pastor Miller called Richard to the pulpit, a hush fell over the congregation. "I owe everyone an apology," Richard began, "especially my mother." He gripped the podium, his usual corporate confidence replaced by genuine humility. "I forgot what Dad taught me. I thought success meant bigger profits, fancier offices. I let greed blind me until I almost destroyed everything my parents built." Margaret watched from her usual pew as her son continued. "I made bad choices, trusted the wrong people. When I lost everything, I convinced myself selling the store was the only way out. I was wrong." Sarah slipped into the pew beside Margaret, placing the memory album between them. "But Dad," Richard's voice caught. "He knew I'd lose my way. He prepared for it. Not just with investments, but with something more valuable. Proof of what the store really means to this community." He gestured to Margaret. "Mom, can you bring up the album?" Margaret carried it to the pulpit. Richard opened it, showing pages to the congregation. "Every Christmas, my parents kept records, not just of sales, but of lives touched. Like the Anderson family, when Mr. Anderson lost his job, or the Williams kids after their mother got sick." He turned more pages. Year after year, quiet acts of kindness. No publicity, no tax write-offs, just love in action. The local news crew covering the story of Sullivan's toy shop's salvation filmed as Richard continued. "Dad's letter wasn't just about saving the store, it was about saving me, reminding me what matters." Pastor Miller stepped forward. "Richard has asked to announce some changes." Richard nodded. "The store is becoming a nonprofit community center. We'll expand the Christmas assistance program, add after-school activities, senior programs, everything Dad dreamed of." The congregation applauded. Margaret saw Claire Davidson slip into the back of the church, watching. "The developers thought they were buying a building," Richard said. "They didn't understand they were trying to buy love, community, hope." Tommy Martinez's family sat near the front, the father's face showing shame matching Richard's. "Mr. Martinez," Richard addressed his former investment partner directly, "I'm sorry I dragged you into bad investments. The community center will have a small business support program. Let us help you rebuild." Tears streaked Martinez's face as he nodded. "The store will continue making handcrafted toys," Richard announced, "but we're also adding a workshop program, teaching kids woodworking, like Dad taught me." Sarah opened the album to a photo of young Richard at Thomas's workbench. "I spent years chasing wealth," Richard concluded. "I forgot I grew up watching true riches being created every day, in smiles, hugs, and Christmas memories." After the service, Claire Davidson approached Richard. "The developers want to donate to the community center," she said. "Good publicity." "On one condition," Richard replied. "The money goes to help families facing foreclosure." She nodded, finally understanding. The congregation moved to the store for Christmas dinner. Tables filled with potluck dishes lined the aisles. Children played with Thomas's old toys while parents shared memories. "Look," Sarah pointed to the window. Through gently falling snow, more families were arriving, carrying food, presents, and 40 years of Christmas spirit. Margaret watched Richard helping Tommy Martinez with his new toy train, just as Thomas had once helped Richard. "He found his way back," Sarah said softly. "His father knew he would." Margaret touched her wedding ring. "That's why he planned everything so carefully." The store, transformed by love and community, glowed with Christmas lights and renewed purpose. Thomas's legacy wasn't just preserved, it was growing into something even more beautiful. Richard caught his mother's eye and smiled, the same smile she remembered from his childhood Christmases. Her son had finally come home. The day after Christmas, Sullivan's toy shop buzzed with activity as the community gathered for a special announcement. The store's windows gleamed with fresh paint, and a new sign hung above the door. Sullivan's Community Center and Toy Shop. Richard stood at the front, no longer in his business suit, but wearing his father's old workshop apron. "Today, we're launching the Thomas Sullivan Foundation," he announced. "Not just to run the community center, but to continue Dad's mission of helping families in need. The crowd applauded as Richard unveiled the plans. We're starting with 3 programs: emergency family assistance, small business support, and children's education. Mr. Martinez stepped forward. As the Foundation's first small business advisor, I'm here to help others avoid the mistakes we made, Rich. Sarah joined them, carrying a stack of papers. The school board approved our after-school program. We start next month. Margaret watched from Thomas's old chair as more announcements followed. The senior center would use the space for morning activities. Local artisans would teach crafting classes. The toy workshop would train apprentices. But first, Richard said, we need to share something. Mom? Margaret opened a worn ledger. For 40 years, I kept track of every family we helped. I never told anyone, but each Christmas, I set aside part of my savings. The room fell silent as she continued. This year, I was ready to sell my house to keep helping others. I thought that would be my final gift to the community. That's not happening, Richard interrupted. But Mom's dedication inspired something new. He unveiled another sign, the Margaret Sullivan Christmas Fund. Every year, he explained, the foundation will match what Mom set aside, helping families just like my parents always did. An elderly man stood up. Guess it's time I shared something too. 30 years ago, the Sullivans helped me start my business. Never knew who paid for that first order of supplies. Others began sharing similar stories: secret help with medical bills, anonymous Christmas presents, quiet acts of kindness that had changed lives. Sarah opened the memory album. That's why we're creating this display, 40 years of Christmas miracles. As people added their stories to the album, Tommy Martinez's choir gathered to perform. But first, Tommy had something to say. Mr. Sullivan helped me practice every day, he said. Just like his dad helped him. Now I want to help other kids learn music. The choir began singing a song Margaret recognized, one Thomas had written years ago for the store's first Christmas. Richard joined her as the music played. Dad's letter said Christmas only works when it's shared. I finally understand. Through the window, more families were arriving, drawn by news coverage of the store's transformation. Many brought donations for the foundation. Others came seeking help. Your father believed everyone had something to give, Margaret said, even if it was just time or kindness. The choir finished to applause. Tommy beamed with pride as Richard gave him a handmade conductor's baton from Thomas's workshop. There's one more thing, Richard said quietly to Margaret. I found Dad's old journals. He wrote about you mortgaging your house to help others during hard times, never telling anyone. Margaret touched her wedding ring. That's what marriage meant to us, sharing everything, even the sacrifices. Sarah joined them, tears in her eyes. The foundation's first board meeting is next week. We already have volunteers, donations. Love multiplies when you share it, Margaret said. Your father taught us that. As the celebration continued, the store that had almost been lost now overflowed with hope and purpose. Thomas's dream hadn't just been saved. It had grown into something even he might never have imagined. His true gift wasn't the money he'd invested. It was the legacy of love he'd taught his family to share, a lesson wrapped in 40 years of Christmas miracles. New Year's Eve found Sullivan's community center and toy shop transformed. The old store area now shared space with classroom corners and workshop stations. Thomas's handmade toys still lined the shelves, but they were joined by student projects and community artwork. Richard stood in his father's workshop, teaching Tommy Martinez and other children the basics of woodworking. Remember what my dad always said, he demonstrated with a sanding block. Patience makes perfect. Margaret watched from the doorway, remembering Thomas teaching young Richard the same lesson. Mom, Richard called out, show them your favorite part. She joined the children at the workbench. Your grandfather had a special way to test if a toy was ready. She ran her hand over a half-finished train. He said you should feel love in every piece. The community center bustled with activity. Sarah led a planning meeting for the after-school program. Mr. Martinez counseled small business owners. The choir practiced in the corner. Mrs. Sullivan? Claire Davidson stood in the doorway. The Developers Foundation sent their donation. Margaret noticed the change in Claire's demeanor. No more corporate aggression, just genuine respect. The money will help 10 families keep their homes, Richard said, setting down his tools. Dad would have liked that. Pastor Miller arrived with more news. 3 other towns want to start similar programs. They're asking for our help. Thomas's vision keeps growing, Margaret smiled. Richard gathered everyone for an announcement. The city approved our expansion plans. We're buying the empty lot next door. He unveiled the blueprints. The new space would include classrooms, a larger workshop, and something special, the Thomas Sullivan Memorial Garden. A place for quiet reflection, Richard explained, where Dad's spirit of giving can inspire future generations. Sarah opened the memory album, now displayed prominently near the entrance. We're adding a digital archive, stories of hope from 40 years of Christmas miracles. Tommy Martinez showed off his first completed project, a small music box that played Silent Night. Just like the one your father made, Margaret told Richard. I remember. Richard touched the delicate workmanship. I thought he was wasting time on details no one would notice. Now I understand. The details are where the love shows. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors. Families seeking help, volunteers offering time, community leaders pledging support. Look at this, Sarah said, showing Margaret the foundation's first quarterly report. We've already helped more families than the store did in its best year. Because now everyone's involved, Margaret replied, just like Thomas wanted. Richard joined them, sawdust on his clothes. The first woodworking class graduates next month. 3 students already have job offers. Margaret touched the wall of photos. 40 years of memories now joined by new hopes, new dreams, new beginnings. Your father once told me, she said to Richard, that true success isn't measured by what you have, but by what you give away. The children's choir gathered for one last practice. Tommy raised his conductor's baton, the one Richard had made him. Mom, Richard said quietly, I was wrong about modernizing the store. What it needed wasn't new inventory or bigger profits. It needed to grow in love. Outside, snow began falling again. Families hurried in, shaking off the cold, finding warmth in more than just the building. Sarah posted the next month's schedule. Reading programs, senior activities, financial classes, toy-making workshops. Thomas's dream had become a community's mission. He knew, Margaret said, watching the happy chaos around them. He knew love would save this place. He just needed us to remember it too. As the choir's voices filled the room, Margaret looked at her son. No longer the lost businessman, but the man his father had always believed he could be. Sullivan's wasn't just a toy shop anymore. It wasn't even just a community center. It had become what Thomas had always envisioned, a place where love multiplied by being shared, where Christmas miracles happened year-round, and where 3 generations had learned the greatest gift was giving. The true spirit of Christmas hadn't just been saved, it had found a permanent home. If you enjoyed this heartwarming Christmas story about family, faith, and the true meaning of giving, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more touching stories that remind us what really matters in life. Share in the comments your own special Christmas memory or a moment when someone's kindness changed your life. Remember, just like Thomas Sullivan taught us, real wealth isn't counted in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the love we share. See you in our next story.